Okay. Change that a
Just
little bit.
a bit better.
Mhm. Okay, so let's see. Um, my sit this morning, I noticed a pleasant sensation in my left hand uh, that I started to focus on, and as I focused on it more, um, I noticed other parts of my body starting to relax more. And so I continued to just kind of let my attention stay there because that seemed like a good spot. So I got, felt pretty snug in my posture for a little while. That was probably like the highlight of this morning's sit. Um, and then I had a um, it wasn't a sit, but I was just kind of meditating while going through public transportation and stuff. And I noticed that I was aware of thoughts starting to form, but not being a fully formed thought, but I knew that the thought was going to be an unwholesome thought. So instead, I verbally acknowledged my success at noticing the unwholesome thought about to erupt, and then I just focused more on the breath, um, which leads me sort of to my first question, where if I get to the point where I notice thoughts beginning to form, is it right effort to then use a verbal thought to acknowledge it, or is that being counterproductive?
No, that's exactly the right way to do it.
Okay,
And the acknowledgement of it should also be the basis of joy,
right. Okay,
in the sense of a joyful thought of, ah, I see that.
right, right. Yeah, I
Well,
would.
well, I caught you early before you actually formed.
Right, right, right. Okay. Then I will continue to do that when I notice that happening. Um, oh, yeah. I've also been noticing a sensation um, that appears inside of my head, pretty centered around the central part inside my head, if you were to imagine my head as a sphere. Um, and it's a pleasant sensation. It feels kind of like a crinkly sort of sensation, or like Rice Krispies, if you're familiar with that cereal. Um,
In other words, you're beginning to snap, crackle, and pop. Huh?
I guess so. Yeah. I'm not sure if I should maybe focus on that sensation more, or just kind of let it do its thing as it does its thing, or
Actually, um, let us put it this way. Think of what is worthy of paying attention to
mm-hmm.
is a salad that has all kinds of things in it.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then think of things that are not worthy paying attention to is like a smorgasbord of all the wrong stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the things that might be sweet, like meat and potatoes and candy and ice cream and
Right.
biscuits and all of that, and the wholesome stuff is like a salad.
Right. Okay.
And so while you're eating the salad, you begin to notice this, that, and the other thing that's coming
Mm-hmm.
up.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, most of the stuff is coming up right here, right now, one by one as they occur.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And every
Okay.
one of them is worth paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to where the unwholesome stuff that's likely to come up is almost always mental,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to where the things that are wholesome and worth paying attention to are both mental and sensational.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So
And I
this.
mean that in both ways.
Right. 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 Great. Great. So this is then related to another question that I had, where um sometimes, I'll be working on gladdening the mind, and uh, my focus on the breath will no longer be primary. And so instead of focusing on the in and out as a continuous, uninterrupted stream, it's more discontinuous, but it's being filled by um, positive mental sensations. Like I'll go like woo, or yes.
Yes, okay. That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's how the Anapanasati Sutta is actually laid out.
Okay.
And but it's laid out in that way that's actually a detail then that is hard to notice because it's not saying these things specifically, but it is laid out that way. And that the way to begin to look at it is that the breath itself, though you can control it now when you're thinking about it, you've always been able to control it.
Mm-hmm.
That there's not a lot of learning going on with the breath to learn how to do it, but rather that you use the breath because you already know how to use that. All of the other steps of Anapanasati are, in fact, the verb is not to understand, to note, or to see, but to train.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to train the mind while we're watching the breath.
Mm-hmm.
While we're breathing in, we create gladdening of the mind. And while we're breathing out, we create gladdening the mind. While we breathe in, we experience the mind. While we're breathing out, we experience the mind. While we're breathing in, we experience the body. While we're breathing out, we experience the body.
Mm-hmm.
You beginning to understand what I'm talking about? Okay, so the experience of the body is a training because most people don't pay much attention to their body. They know how to breathe,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't know how to pay attention to the body. Or when I say pay attention, perhaps a better word would be to investigate.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the Mahasi system, instead of using the word investigate, they use the word noting.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in fact, it when it's done right, it's the same thing. But unfortunately, in the English language, we use the word note as a different thing, like taking notes.
Mm-hmm.
Noting something and taking notes about it is not the same thing. One's a witness in the sense of seeing what's going on, and the other one is a witness in the sense of being on the witness stand telling a story.
Right. Right. Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's much better when we're investigating is to actually see what's going on, the
Mm-hmm.
investigation. And there's a lot to see.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole lot of body going on, there's a whole lot of feeling going on, and there's a whole lot of mental stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
that the training is to come out of the unwholesome qualities and stay with that salad that we were
okay.
talking about with all the various wholesome things. And we'll talk more and more about what are some of the wholesome things to pay
Mm-hmm.
attention to.
Right. So, other teachers, when I've listened or read them talk about anapanasati, they seem to emphasize the continuous focus on the breath sensations. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's okay if that gets interrupted, so long as the interruption is a wholesome thought or another sensation that's in the present moment.
Precisely. And that
Okay.
whatever is happening doesn't take you away from the breath. The unwholesome part, the meat and potatoes, you're going to stop
Right.
thinking about the breath and go off and chase that stuff.
Right. Okay.
There's another way of looking at it, and that is the very, very beginner, when he's just getting started, he's got his plate full just by watching the breath. But that's about as much as he can do. And then the mind will wander away, and it'll stay wandered away, and it'll take a while before he figures out the mind has wandered away, and so he'll come back to the breath. But eventually, as you begin to get some skill, you recognize, oh, while I'm watching the breath, I've got plenty of time left to do some other things. And so we're going to use that time while we're watching the breath to actually train the mind. And so many people will say, oh, yes, I can watch the breath, but I'm having these background thoughts. The answer is, okay, now that you're watching the breath, pay attention to those background thoughts to make sure they too are wholesome and associated with the here now. As opposed to the old meat and potato thoughts that we used to have, because if we keep those, now we may be focusing on the breath, but we're not doing any of the training that needs to be done.
Okay, great.
I'm glad that makes easy sense for you, because I can go into a great deal about it.
No, that makes sense. It was yeah, I wasn't sure if, kind of what I already described, if that was okay, if my mind wasn't, completely locked into the continuous, frames of the breath moving, if it was okay that my attention was jumping to wholesome thoughts, and it sounds like that is okay. So that's great.
The Buddha has a word for it in the sense of the hindrances when he calls them adventitious defilements. Now, what that means is that they will find an opportunity. They'll find a crack in the wall. They'll find a sill under the door or whatever to creep in. That they
Yes.
take their advantage.
Yes, I've been noticing that, especially often. I'll say often, but it was more like 2 days ago. It's been less often today, but where I'll have a wholesome thought and then a unwholesome thought attached to it, like a parasite, like immediately after. And then I will notice that is there, and um, congratulate myself for noticing it, and try to, uproot it with more wholesome intention and energy. Yeah.
I don't know of a better analogy. If I did, I would use it. But the analogy that I often use is the analogy of a bar, and there is the head bouncer is actually out in the looking over every customer before they get in, one after another. So you can see that line of customers. You can come through. No, you stay out. You can come through. Out you go. That kind of thing. And so that's what you're beginning to see is that you're standing at that doorway guarding, and you can watch the wholesome and the unwholesome mixed together. That's excellent.
So I have that brings to mind a new question, where sometimes I will have thoughts, say, for example, like a song lyric, and I'm not quite sure if it's wholesome or unwholesome. Um, there are certain song lyrics that I would classify obviously as unwholesome, but there are others that to me seem more neutral in quality. So I don't know, maybe I could hear your take on that, if it's all unwholesome or what.
No, we need some discernment in there.
Okay.
First off, there are jingles, songs, lyrics, etc., like that that can be very wholesome
Okay.
for gladdening the mind.
Uh-huh.
Examples of that would be zippity doo dah, zippity yay.
Sure.
My oh my, what a wonderful day.
Yeah,
Uh,
I like some Bob Marley too.
yeah, Bob
Yeah.
Marley's got don't
Don't
worry, be
worry about
happy.
it. Yeah, don't worry
Yeah,
about a thing. Yeah.
don't worry about a thing. There's another one from Oklahoma. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh,
Right.
what a beautiful day.
Okay.
Oh, I've got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way. And another one would be from Satchmo. It's a wonderful world.
Mm-hmm.
Da ta ta ta.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one would be smile, darn ya, smile.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, if you see what I've done is I've gone through about 4 songs, one in a row.
Mm-hmm.
By doing that, that means that I have to shove that old song out in order to put the new song in.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're becoming to another point, and that is if a song comes into the mind and it gets stuck,
Mm-hmm.
then it's not so wholesome anymore.
Okay.
And the best way to push a song out of the mind is by bringing another one in.
Alrighty. I'll try to remember that one. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes, they can become unwholesome if they get stuck.
Okay.
And the easy way to get it unstuck is by shoving it out, by starting to. It's really, really hard for the human mind to sing 2 different songs at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's another point. And then there are songs that have value to them, but it's not that really bouncy kind of thing. An
Mm-hmm.
example of that would be some symphonies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Possibly the one that would go to the opposite extreme of Zippity Doodah would be Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, and the name of it is the Pathétique.
Okay.
And that he was going through a really, really dark stage in his life. I used to tell the story that his wife had just died, but I've got a friend who's a musicologist who's got more detail. In fact, he's from Estonia. His name is Tun,
Uh-huh.
and he's quite a good friend. He stays here, by the way, at Wat Suan Mok.
Uh-huh.
And his old years, he was a musicologist. And so he, being from Eastern Europe, he knows all of the stories about the Russian musicians. And he says, oh no, that actually Tchaikovsky himself was going through a really, really bad spot when
Mm-hmm.
he wrote that.
Mm-hmm.
And that in fact, after he wrote it, he didn't write a seventh, he went ahead and X'd himself. So this was like his suicide way out.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
and it has its own beauty.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually quite remarkable piece of music. If you don't know what I mean, then
Mm-hmm.
Google it because it's on Google. And
Okay.
so you have these two extremes
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes pathetic music is actually quite beautiful
Mm-hmm.
because it does bring up beautiful emotions in us.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Another one would on in that regard would be Pavan.
Okay.
Do you know that piece?
No, I don't think the first one you mentioned I might recognize it by ear. But I don't think the second one doesn't sound familiar.
Okay, the third one that I would recommend in that regard
Could you spell it for me so I can write it down?
Pavan, Pavan,
Mm-hmm.
would be the way that I would look for it.
Okay. And the first one
Um,
was Chavatsky.
and the first one was Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony,
Tchaikovsky 6. Mm-hmm.
to where the Ode to Joy, which is the fourth movement of Beethoven's symphony,
Right, yeah, I know that one. Mm-hmm.
okay, he had written that after he had syphilis so bad that he had gone deaf and he was actually going crazy in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that the way that he would do it, he had the piano legs cut off of his piano, and that he would have a stick of wood that he would either place on his chin or on his throat
Mm.
while he was laying there on the floor, playing the music to get the tonality out of it where he could actually hear it.
Mm-hmm.
He actually had to put his ear right to the keyboard of to that stick to be able to hear the piano.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that one's most notable for being the most pathetic piece of music that people just cry with joy when they hear it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So pathos touches something really deep inside, to where the other side is the very lighthearted.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's a lot of music that's very telling. I'll use the example of Rod Stewart. I can't get no satisfaction.
Right, sure. Mm-hmm.
Now, he's pretty well hopping around the stage enjoying singing that song, but the whole point of the song is he can't get any satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so this is a way to begin to look at music is that there are things within the music itself, but really we're using this music to evoke or to help promote gladdening the mind, to cheer it up, to let it become bright, to be able to see the deep beauty that is there for us to see. And so music does have value. Now, in the time of the Buddha, about the only kind of music they had was war drums or the kind of drumming that was, I guess, rites and rituals for sexuality.
Okay.
Let us say ancient primitive boogie woogie music.
Uh-huh.
Now that stirs up the emotions, and this is the kind of music that we really don't need to spend much time with.
Okay.
Is the kind that elicits bad feelings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So by paying close attention with discernment about the music that we are listening to, it can actually be of enormous value. But if we're not, then we can start listening. And you could actually see that there is something that happened that's actually quite marvelous, not what happened, but to be able to see the transition that music in the United States kind of parallel the politics. That music was really bright and gay, and then we had the Vietnam War, and here comes the Beatles. And then we have Reagan coming in, and that's when music in the 1980s took a really dark tone, and that led to acid rock and to gangster rap, which was the 90s when everybody was getting jailed for things. And so you can see, interestingly enough, that the nation's politics is paralleled by the music. I wonder when the music is going to start getting really lighthearted again. Because generally it's not in the present time, that we have to go back a ways to find good music, because today's modern music is in fact not promotive of wisdom or the ability to see things very clearly. But zippity doo-dah, that one helps.
Yeah.
Smile, darn ya, smile. That's useful.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. All right. Okay. Um, well, I mean, that's all the questions that I had. So I'm not sure if there's something else that you felt was important to impart um, today.
Yes,
Yeah.
in the beginning of practice,
Mm-hmm.
we talk and focus mostly on the breath.
Mm-hmm.
And then we begin to understand, oh no, that the breath is sort of like the bowl or the plate that we put the salad in.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right, so now we need to start inspecting some of that salad that we're
Mm-hmm.
putting in there.
Mm-hmm.
And this is broken down into the four foundations of mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
which is called the Satipatthana.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a Satipatthana Sutta, and there is the Anapanasati Sutta, and it looks like that they don't mix very well until you really start looking at things, and then you see, oh, that actually Anapanasati is for the fulfillment of the foundations of mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're practicing it for.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can begin to think of that salad then as this body-mind complex.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the beginning of practice, we work with sati in the sense of waking up the mind. And that is normally referred to then as the first part of Sita Nupassana, um, in the sense of experiencing the mind. Now, by experiencing the mind in that first step is only to experience, is it hindered? Are the thoughts hindrances, or am I free from hindrance?
Okay.
But we also begin to experience the mind in more ways, and what you've already started talking about that, so there's more to do there. But we begin to experience, is the mind bright, is it
Mm-hmm.
dull, is
Mm-hmm.
it sharp, is it exemplary, is it exalted, is it rubbish?
All right.
And so we begin to see what states of mind we are. Now, if it gets dull, the easy solution to that is let's take a little more air because we probably are not breathing well.
Right.
That's when it'll get dull.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we begin to look about what kind of doubts are there? What are the doubts that are in the mind? Are there any doubts clouding the mind now? Doubts about practice, doubts about um, what to do or how to live, that kind of thing. So we begin to experience or actually dissect these hindrances
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and put them into categories. And
I've
we do
noted.
that by experiencing the mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I noticed that most of my um, unwholesome thoughts are related to whether or not I'm practicing correctly in that moment. So it's a lot of
That's doubt.
yes, yes, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
That's important to recognize. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let us say that we've got um, another kind would be wanting things that we don't have, like wanting value out of our meditation. A clear example of that would be wanting to become enlightened
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as opposed to just doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we begin to want things. There
Mm-hmm.
are also, and it generally happens in the sitting practice, that we become dissatisfied with certain bodily sensations. The legs
Mm-hmm.
hurt, or the chest hurts, or tension gets in the back of the neck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we need to become alert to that kind of stuff
Mm-hmm.
and start to watch the body and also watch how we feel about it
Mm-hmm.
so that we don't stay in in a state of being dissatisfied with what's happened. Now, off the cushion, you're going to get a lot of that. The world
Uh,
really is full of problems, and you're going to be very excellent at watching what all the problems is. The
uh-huh.
question is, are you going to be dissatisfied with all these problems, or are you going to be okay with them?
Mm-hmm. So, I've heard teachers say different things about pain or unpleasant sensations, ranging from don't focus on them at all, stay in the pleasant sensations, to dive into the unpleasant sensations and start, getting familiar with them. Um, what's your take on that?
Both
Both? Okay.
and neither.
Okay.
In the world of both, let's look at it from this perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I use the term hide and go seek
Okay.
because so many people know that children's game of hide and go seek, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we've got that terminology in there to help us remember. It's a little mnemonic or a meme. And
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to do is turn that upside down
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that we're going to seek
Mm-hmm.
before we hide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the seeking, it means that we're really going to start paying attention to it. If
Mm-hmm.
there is leg pain, then we're going to try to focus on where the pain is. The surprise is that if we look at that end of the pain, it goes away and the pain goes up to the other side. If I go up there to look for the pain, then it'll come back where I was looking in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That the sensations will move around, that
Mm-hmm.
they're not localized in one place, that it's hard to find or pinpoint exactly where that is.
Mm-hmm.
The point is that the neurons that are on the surface of the skin and also deeper are connected together. You're not going to have one neuron in one place fire. They're going to fire kind of as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And so we begin to identify the area of the pain and we begin to get familiar with it. And after we're getting pretty good with that, then we turn it off. We ignore it. We go someplace else. We start paying
Okay.
attention to other stuff.
Okay.
And that we continue to do that until that pain perhaps comes back to try to crowd into the mind.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it comes back again in a way that we have to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we go through that sequence again.
Okay.
Now, there's another point about that, and that is that it's not a good idea
Mm-hmm.
for anyone to intentionally sit in pain without a particular value for it.
Mm-hmm.
In the Goenka method, they have what is called the strong determination sitting, where the student doesn't open his eyes or his hands or arms or his feet,
Yeah, I
but then
did.
he will adjust the posture from time to time. But that's all the movement there is,
Yeah,
and that
I
will
did
actually,
go on a retreat. Yeah, so I'm familiar.
and so that kind of brings in that leg pain,
Right. Yeah.
mostly because Westerners, when they were really little kids, they were picked up off the floor and put into a high chair.
Mm-hmm.
To where the Asian kids were not picked up off the floor. They've been living on the floor. They eat on the floor their whole lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've got I'll call her a young lady now. She's actually a university student, but I've known her since she was 12.
Mm-hmm.
And since that time and continuously, whenever she's eating her food, she sits in the full lotus posture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She does that naturally. She's been able to do it her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
The Zen, what's called the Zen posture, is actually sitting on your heels,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the posture that you can get up really fast out of. That would be the posture that the samurai would have, so that they can actually, in one movement, while they're unholstering their knife and beginning to drag it out, they are also putting their left foot up
Mm-hmm.
so that they can begin to rise and they can stand up immediately so that they can just go from sitting posture to whap like that and cut somebody's head half in two with a very quick motion.
Mm-hmm.
Westerners try to get into that posture and it is painful.
Mm-hmm.
painful to sit on the knees or on the heels. It causes pain in the knees. It causes pain in the muscles in the back. But in Japan and in Thailand, the kids sit in those postures on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Westerners, no.
Mm-hmm.
Which means when they go to the dojo or to the retreat and they have to sit in these postures, they start to have a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually not well recommended for you to sit in pain. I know several monks that sit so ferociously for so long that now they can't sit anymore. They only sit in chairs.
Oh.
Achan Subaro and Achan Bila Maramsi are two of them who've ruined their legs through working too hard.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So when I got to Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, he recommended differently, and I started doing that at the retreats differently and recommending to the students.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that when there is leg pain,
Mm-hmm.
adjust your legs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't sit in pain.
Mm-hmm.
There will be enough pain in your life to take a look at. But while you're sitting, there's no reason to sit in pain if your intention is to cultivate joy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can see that. Now, however, going back to the strong determination sitting, if you have an intention for it, if there is something to be gained from it,
Mm-hmm.
then it is actually a good, proper exercise to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when you're developing the lion inside, that you can handle anything. Then you're just going to sit there. You're not going to move because you're on top of it. Let it rain.
Mm-hmm.
Let it rain, pain. I can handle it.
Yeah, I definitely experienced some of that at the Goenka retreat that I attended.
All right. Now,
Yeah.
the kind of folks that need that kind of training would be CIA officers who expect to get captured and tortured.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that when they go into that torture session, they can begin to laugh at their torturers. They frustrate the torturers because the torturers can't make them suffer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Their mind is sharp enough that they don't suffer.
Mm-hmm.
The next group of people are the ones who pretend to be Jesus and intend to get themselves nailed up to a cross. They need
Mm-hmm.
this kind of vipassana to be able to handle that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that kind of mentality is actually part of the training that the Buddha himself went through.
Right.
The austerities.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see some guy, there's one guy, I haven't seen pictures of him in a long time, but this guy actually is able to take one of these really giant fish hooks, put it in his flesh to hook a couple of ribs, and then he'll hang himself from the rope, dangling by that fish hook that's
Uh-huh.
attached to a couple of ribs, and there he is laughing and bouncing.
Right.
It
Yeah.
tends to be bouncing. I show you. There's other folks, and there's actually the pictures come from Thailand, to where this guy has holes in his cheeks, and in that he could shove 9 or 10 knives this way and 9 or 10 knives that way,
Yeah.
just to show off. And he's
Mm-hmm.
got a big grin on his face. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
these are not really recommended practices, but it does show that you can get over pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to just simply get over it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's easier to learn to get over little pain than it is to learn to get over the really big stuff. If you can get over the little stuff, then you can get over the big stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it all takes that attitude of, I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that regard, we begin to have the attitude, even as a regular meditator, that no matter how obstructed the mind gets, no matter how often the hindrances come by, no matter how unfocused or how much drowsiness or whatever that is in the mind right now that's hindering me from being in joy, I can throw that stuff out and come back to this present moment and see things the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
This is in fact called the first knowledge.
Okay.
This is the first knowledge that is noble, supramundane, a factor of the path, and not held by ordinary people. Most people don't have that can-do attitude. Most people, they say things like a leopard can't change his spots or the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Boys will be boys.
Mm-hmm.
That's just Kathy. All of these things that have to do with that once a person is formed in their personality, they're bound to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the first knowledge on the path to Sotapan that is, in fact, the change of attitude to can do, that no matter what hindrance comes, or when that hindrance keeps coming back over and over again, like you'll have a good thought and riding on its coattails is an unwholesome thought.
Mm-hmm.
We keep seeing that and we say that it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I can throw those unwholesome thoughts out and come back to the present moment and start having thoughts about what's happening in this present moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the noble. That's the first step of nobility. And it is not shared by ordinary people. It is, in fact, becoming supramundane. It's rising above the hindrances, it's rising above the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say, I can do that, then that's the first noble knowledge. The
Mm-hmm.
knowledge is success.
Mm-hmm.
This is the knowledge that the Pali word for it is called Shraddha. And Shraddha does not mean faith, it means confidence.
Mm-hmm.
You are confident that even if the mind gets drowsy, I can take a deep breath, I can wake myself up, I can dust myself off, and I can come back into a state of joy.
Mm-hmm.
And we practice that over and over and over again, and that's what's eventually going to lead us to the first jhana. Okay, so going back to that business of the salad, that means that while I'm breathing in and while I'm breathing out, there's actually quite a lot to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that we first look at it in the sense of this is stuff to do with the mind. But eventually, when we get this attitude that I can, in fact, clean the mind out and come back to this present moment over and over again, that's what gets the feeling started. In other words, when we have the right view that's focused on, somebody said affirmations, and so I'll leave that gladdening of the mind in the point of affirmations. But when we do it over and over and over and over and over again, we
Mm-hmm.
actually begin to feel really good.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that feeling really good is what we would call then rapture, which is the feeling of success, the feeling of, I can do this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's when we actually do have that feeling of yippee ki
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer a song, it's no longer a lyrics, it's no longer something you tell yourself, it's something we actually experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's also something that's to be developed. That's a skill to be developed, the skill of being a winner. The Buddha was called a lion. This is literally the skill of becoming a lion.
Mm-hmm.
No longer being a student, no longer being a scumbag, but being a winner, being a lion, being on top of the world.
Mm-hmm.
The Pali word for that is lokatara, and we translate it into the supramundane, is we're no longer in it, we're on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that we're on top of it. And that gives us the feeling of great success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That feeling of success is both brought on by and also contributes to the feeling of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
The satisfaction of, wow, this is really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So that can do attitude brings on that state of satisfaction. This is also a skill to be developed.
Mm-hmm.
And in the world of Anapanasati, now we've been talking about step 1 and 2 and 3 of experiencing the body. When we do this, the body will eventually start to relax, which
Mm-hmm.
means now we don't have any more leg pain. We can just sit.
Mm-hmm.
But that takes a long, long time, but it will occur mostly because what's really coming out of it all is our dissatisfaction. that sensation is no longer experienced in the leg as pain. It's just a sensation.
Right. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so now we have also step 5 of Anapanasati and step 6 of Anapanasati, that being piti and sukha, or the pleasure. And so we can see already now we're beginning to get all the notes on the piano together.
Mm-hmm.
At first we start with chopsticks, but eventually we're going to add the dark keys too,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can begin now to play full music by developing a whole set of skills.
Mm-hmm.
The skill of being a winner and the attitude of a winner, the skill of being satisfied,
Mm-hmm.
the feeling of being secure and safe and free from fear.
Mm-hmm.
hmm We also begin to see everything changing. Everything is in flux. That it's not just a Nietzsche in the sense of occasionally a laptop breaks, but it's in the process of breaking down its whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And that some things can be seen to be changing very quickly, and other things appear to be changing slowly, but on the inside, they're actually changing very fast. And so that's also part of the waking up, is to begin to see that we're actually in a flood. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a stream. We don't enter the stream, we enter the reality, and the reality is happening so much of it so fast that the senses can barely keep up
Mm-hmm.
with all this happening. That things get immensely complicated and yet immensely simple, because all that complexity can be boiled down to just one law of physics, the law of causality. And so let's look at that in the sense of the law of gravity. The law of gravity is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. There is no place that you can go on the planet Earth to where you can drop a cup and it floats up.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere you go, gravity will grab that cup. So that means that gravity is all knowing. There is no place that it forgets. It's also all powerful. It'll drop things at 32 feet per second per second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Everywhere you go, no matter what. And so, in that regard, gravity alone fulfills all the requirements that the Christians put on God: omnipresent, omnipotent,
Mm-hmm.
omniscient. It knows every cup that's falling. It knows, and every cup will fall. It's got that kind of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we can take that property of gravity and now put it on the property of causality that the Buddha called Idiapapajayata. That's the name that he gave it.
Okay.
But it basically means that with this, there is that, and without this, there is not that.
Right.
But that's
Mm-hmm.
a very simple way. Another way of looking at it is nourishment. If you're starving and need a meal, you'll be okay, you'll be good. If you're starving and you don't get food, then you'll die. That's
Mm-hmm.
just nourishment. Okay, so everything's got a cause, and everything very quickly becomes an effect.
Mm-hmm.
And when we begin to understand that law, two things we can use. One is when we begin to study the mind, we can see that the mind is a process. It's a series of events. This happens, causing that happens, causing that happens, causing a feeling, causes a wanting, causing a craving, etc., like that. And
Yep.
so there's a whole stream of things that happen one after another.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the kind of causality that we begin to understand that we live in a sea of causality, that God is within us and without us, at the whole environment, or the whole universe, in fact. We use the word universe in the sense that no matter how much diversity is, it's
Mm-hmm.
still just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in it. We're in a sea of the universe. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we begin to understand causality like that, that places us through proper practice into a state of at one-ment.
Mm-hmm.
Or as the Dalai Lama said to the hot dog vendor when he was in New York, Make me one with everything.
Oh man. Is that your joke?
Oh no, that's an old one.
Oh man.
We also use words like atonement or
Uh-huh.
at-one-ment. When we use the word atonement, that means that everything is satisfied, all the debts have been paid, and we're in tune with the universe.
Mm-hmm. I haven't
And
heard that
so
one either.
that's just actually in another way of saying just be here now, be in this present moment. And by the way, I just heard that Ram Dass has just died at the age of 87. He's the one who wrote the
Oh,
book Be Here Now back in the
yeah.
70s.
Yeah, that was the first spiritual book I ever came across.
Well, if you read it well, it's the only one you ever needed.
I guess I didn't read it well enough.
Be here now.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not here now. We're all thinking about there and then,
Mm-hmm.
or we're planning on the future. We're making plans. We're not enjoying this present moment. But when we begin to gather these skills together, when we develop these things to the point that they are skills, then that's gathering the factors together so that we become a unified whole.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the word samadhi does not mean concentration, it means gathering together the faculties that are needed. And so, the first jhana, the gathering of the faculties, would one be free from hindrance
Mm-hmm.
or secluded. And then the joy and the pleasure of being secluded, plus taking good deep breaths and breathing well, is going to keep the mind oxygenated and putting it fit for work so that we have the ability to apply the mind and sustain it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what we're going to do to sustain the mind is to sustain it in wholesome thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're beginning to look at Anapanasati as an all-encompassing practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got all of these little tiny details to it, but those details are not details, they're skills to be developed, each one
Mm-hmm.
of them. And all of that's to be happening during that time when we're noticing this is an in-breath. From the beginning of the in-breath to the end of the in-breath, you've got lots of time to develop these skills.
Mm-hmm. 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 Should I go about it a systematic way, or just whatever
Well,
occurs?
that's a better way of looking at it. Some of it is time oriented in the sense that the first thing that happens is sati. You can't gladden the mind and then be aware of gladdening the mind. You've got to start at the beginning, and that is to wake up
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
to realize, and
Mm-hmm.
then to gladden the mind. And through gladdening the mind, eventually we will feel like the lion
Mm-hmm.
as the skills develop. So there is a kind of an order there to it, but once you've got the skills developed, now we can play the music in almost any order that we want to,
Mm-hmm.
whichever is most suitable for you at that particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
So,
go ahead.
yeah. So as far as gladdening the mind, will I kind of know that it's reached its peak when there's no more desire for it to be gladdened any more than it already is?
Yes, and that should be happening on that first in breath,
Okay.
and then happening again on the second in breath.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay.
Doesn't hurt to keep reminding yourself that this is good. This is nice. It's
Okay.
actually an affirmation of the progress that you're making. And it's good during the investigation to continue to investigate in the sense of how is the sati? How is the investigation? Is the gladdening working? How am I feeling? In other words, it's a full on investigation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
including the investigation then of the Four Noble Truths. That's ultimately the goal. It's not ultimately the goal, it's one of the big goals, is to start focusing more and more, paying attention more and more to the Four Noble Truths.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense, is this dukkha?
Mm-hmm.
If it is, then what is the cause of it? Let's go chase that down. If it's not dukkha, yippee-ki-yo-ki-yay, I've got the third noble truth. This is a little Nirvana. This is nice. This is wonderful. Let's inspect it and get a good load of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth noble truth would be the Eightfold Noble Path. This is sati. This is right effort. Reflecting upon what is right view, what is right attitude, etc., like that. This will then bring about unification of mind. So now the question is, how unified is the mind?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so this is the kind of investigation that we would have that has all of the constituent components.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the way to practice. And when I would tell a beginner this, it sounds overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to get started on just enough to get the student going.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably not ready yet to do all of it,
Mm-hmm.
but you're recognizing there is a lot there to do. Let's dive in and start practicing.
Yeah. 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 All right. Well,
Okay.
sounds
Do you
good.
have any questions about this?
Um, I have a question. It's not fully formed, and it's kind of slightly tangential.
Okay,
But
we'll fully form and bring it up next time, and we'll finish off now.
okay. All right. No worries.
Okay,
All
because I've
right.
got another call waiting, and so I'll say a happy goodbye and
Yeah,
and go have some fun with your practice.
I will. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Have a have a wonderful next breath.
All right. All right. Bye bye.
There it was. I saw it.
It's free.
Right. And the best things in life are free.
Alrighty, bye bye.